1, 2. Hey, hello everyone. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful day. It's really nice to see everyone. This is the second lecture in our program, Explorations in Jewish Culture and History. And we have a great speaker today. Our talk is part of, we have multi-sponsors for it, including the Unitarian Church, to whom we are tremendously grateful for this wonderful venue for a talk. I don't think there's a better one in this, really, in the city. I don't know of any anyway. And Bob has been so generous with us. But we're also sponsored by the two Methodist churches, the Episcopal Church. I always don't want to do this because I'll forget somebody. But the Lutheran Church, no, I know. And the Bethel A Baptist Church and the city of Brevard. Mayor's here, so we really appreciate that. So, we have our speaker this afternoon is Professor Marni Davis of Georgia State University in Atlanta. She comes from New York or Long Island. She went to college at Boston University, then at the New School for Social Research, then at Emory University, where she got her PhD. She has published a number of interesting articles about not just the subject we're talking about, but about urban culture in general, and the South, in the South, especially in the Jewish part the Jews have played in that. And if you want in the question and answer period, you can ask her even more general questions if you have them about the South and Southern Jewish history, which is a very important topic. As some of you may know, in the early history of the Jews in America, there were more Jews in the South than in the North for a period. She is the editor of American Jewish History, which is the top journal in American Jewish history. And it's a very old journal. It goes back to the 1890s. It used to come, it was called Proceedings of the American Jewish Historical Society, founded by a number of really prominent German Jewish Jews. And it's essential for any student of Jewish history. It has published primary sources and now mostly important interpretive essays. And to be editor of that journal is, I think, a tremendous honor. She's here mostly because of a book she she published about 10 years ago, Jews and Booze, Becoming American in the Age of Prohibition. Jews are not as commonly as other immigrant groups are known for being big drinkers, but they were very much a part of the liquor trade, as you'll find out. And it was an important part, especially of immigrant experience. They were both workers and entrepreneurs in the business, and they were doing well, and then they hit Prohibition, which of course was a really difficult thing when your business is basically taken away from you. So her book is about all that. It begins talking about the early part and then ends with the period of Prohibition. Well, it's a fascinating book. Reviewed widely, and she published with a great press, NYU Press. Why is it great? Because they published two of my books. Anyone who does that knows what they're doing. Anyway, she's I've gotten to know her a little the last day, and wonderful person, and I think must be a great teacher. That's how you find out when you know a person. So what? So without any further ado, let me introduce Professor Marni Davis, Jews and Booze.
Thank you, Howard. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I want to also take a moment to just thank Howard Rock for inviting me to come to Brevard. I want to thank both Howard and Ellen for being such gracious hosts. Who have let me stay in their home for the last day. And I want to thank the Brevard Jewish community who, in their lecture series, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Transylvania County, and everyone who I've met over the past 24 hours or so who's really made me feel so welcome and at home in this lovely town that I've never been to before, and I'm definitely coming back because you guys have a lot of good stuff going on here. Howard said a little bit about my book, but I do have to say that people often ask me, even despite the title, Jews and Booze, so what is your book about? Which, which is, I kind of always refer them to the subtitle because I really think that it does all of the heavy lifting. This idea of becoming American in the age of Prohibition. And the age of Prohibition, the parameters that I put up, it begins during the temperance era, which is the 1870s, and ends with the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. So chronologically, those are my historical parameters. But the question of becoming American is a really complicated one, and one that Americans are still debating today and struggling over these issues today. It's a discussion today, too. The overarching argument that I make in my book is that American Jewish ideas about the production and consumption of alcohol in this early period was within the parameters of American conversations about alcohol. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Was it the worst thing ever to happen to American society? Was it just another product that people had every right to consume if that's what they wanted to do? And American Jews were within the mainstream of that conversation until the conversation changed and American Jews found themselves outside of the mainstream, not only outside of it, but on the losing side of it, and then vilified for it. And so that's sort of the historical story that I want to tell. And it's part of a way of thinking about the whole idea of Americanization. I think it's often framed as an immigrant comes to the United States and slowly but surely they learn what it means to become an American, and it's kind of like a linear upward process. And I think that the research that I did and the book that I wrote show that, in fact, it is far less linear. It's, in fact, sometimes a bumpy process. And also that the questions about what it means to become an American, even within the group itself, even within the American Jewish community, broadly speaking, was a subject that was much contested and a topic of in-group friction. So that's the broad story of what my book is about. And I will start sort of with the basis of the claim that really begins it all, which was that American Jews were robustly engaged in the American alcohol trade, particularly in the years between the Civil War and the Great Depression. So we might ask, why was that? Part of the answer is because dating all the way back to the rabbinic period, thousands of years ago, so for millennia, Jews have had some familiarity with the production of wine so that they could make kosher wine, because kosher wine was especially sacramental, and it had to be produced by observant Jews from the moment that the grapes were picked from the vine to its pouring into the cup. So because of that, Jews did develop a familiarity with alcohol production over the course of then the early Jewish history into the early modern period. That expertise expanded in Europe and also in the Middle East into the production of beer and the production of distilled liquors, often because they were in places where alcohol was considered sinful, like what Jews who lived in Muslim lands, they often would produce alcohol for Muslims who would, decry alcohol in public and then drink it in private. And Jews were often part of that. That was the same as true in Christian Europe. So because of that, they brought that familiarity. And this was especially true in Eastern Europe, both Central and Eastern Europe, where because of restrictions on Jewish economic activity in those places, they were often sort of marginalized in terms of their occupations and limited to very small number of jobs that they could have. And one of those jobs was tavern keeper and alcohol producer, which made them vilified in their home countries too, but it again gave them sort of generations of familiarity with alcohol production. None of that would have mattered if they hadn't come to a country that was so well known for extremely enthusiastic alcohol consumption, which is exactly what the United States was from the very moment of the country's founding. Europeans who came to the young United States and sort of traveled around to report on what this new country, this new radical country looked like, often commented on how much people drank. And they started drinking in the morning, they gave their children alcohol, they were drinking all the way into the evening. And so clearly there was a market. And so Jews who arrived in the United States starting in the period after the Civil War were able to put their expertise to use. And so here's where we see that there are all over the country a especially famous brewer of beer in Brooklyn, Rheingold beer. And some of you might be familiar with maybe the Rheingold song or the Rheingold girl. That's all sort of post Second World War, and so I don't go into it. But the Rheingold Beer Company, S. Liebman and Sons, had been founded all the way back in the 1880s. Here we see a general store in Natchez, Mississippi, that, if it's hard to see what it says up there, the sign advertises whiskey and gin. And then Rabbi Meyer Hirsch of San Francisco, California, who was a maker of sacramental wine. And I should say here that the American alcohol industry wasn't really friendly to wine production in general. Wine was seen as sort of a hoity-toity beverage that only the wealthiest Americans would really try to access. The American wine, the domestic wine production industry really struggled up until the 20th century. So generally speaking, when people were drinking alcohol, it was beer, distilled liquors and other spirits, and also kosher wine for sacramental purposes. And also, I wanted to mention up top there is, you can see the logo for a company in Atlanta, Meyer and Son Company. David Mayer was actually one of the very first Jews to arrive in the city of Atlanta. He was a founder of several Jewish organizations and religious institutions. And the reason, which speaks a lot to the fact that so many Jews who were engaged in alcohol production also became sort of communal leaders, founding and funding things like synagogues and educational institutions and so on. But the reason why I include David Mayer here is just because I always want to include this incredibly creepy logo. There's no other historical reason for it other than that they made their logo horses with man faces. And you can see that the eldest of the man faces is in fact David Mayer, so I assume, I've never seen pictures of his sons. I kind of assume that those are his sons too. But I just wanted to share that with you because it always kind of freaks me out. But I don't want to make the case, I'm not making the case here that Jews were either themselves mostly, that most of the Jewish community was involved in alcohol production, or that most alcohol producers were Jews. In both cases, they were in the minority. And in fact, even though they were a very visible minority, they were amongst thousands of other Americans of a wide range of religious and ethnic backgrounds, both immigrant and native born, who took up the alcohol trade. But what we see here in their engagement in the trade is a combination of both Jewish culture that has some continuity with the Jewish past, with the current contingent American circumstances that created this ethnic entrepreneurial niche. And it was also a way, because they were involved in both sort of the mainstream of the American alcohol industry, but were also very present and visible in American Jewish communities. It was an opportunity for these Jews to engage in this tension that I'm going to come back to a couple of times between the idea of Jews as participating in universal Americanism, that Jews are part of the American body politic, that Jews are as American and as any other Americans, and they participate in an industry in a way that contributes to American life in lots of ways, including and especially the fact that alcohol was taxed so highly. So alcohol was like the main commodity that filled federal coffers by taxes. But it was also a way for Jews to maintain particularity, to sort of remember their own practices, to nourish their own communal institutions. So this tension between the universal and the particular is really central to American Jewish life, and we're going to come back to it again and again. So alcohol was a mainstream and growing sector of the American economy in the years following the Civil War, but it was also regarded with suspicion and contempt by a growing number of Americans in the years following the Civil War for a number of different reasons. I want to make clear that there was a legitimate argument to be made about the growing power of a national alcohol trade, which seemed to be gathering, during the Gilded Age. This is an era when industrialists are gathering political power to themselves. And for many anti-alcohol activists, liquor and beer, alcohol in general, was regarded as, in its own way, like the railroad industry, for instance. But alcohol had its own valences of horror for anti-alcohol activists because of what it could do to people, to individuals, to families, to communities. And so there's a growing movement to either limit alcohol's availability at first by trying to convince Americans to take a pledge against alcohol, to swear off it as an individual. And that was successful for a little while, but it didn't quite stick. And then increasingly through efforts to create legislation that would ban alcohol entirely from the American consumer market. And it needs to be said that the anti-alcohol movement also had some other strains to it that are important to keep in mind, especially for our story. One of them is an anti-immigrant sentiment. And we can see here a political cartoon of a man who is meant to sort of depict an Irish immigrant. And he's wearing a barrel that says Irish whiskey, and another man who is meant to depict a German immigrant, and it says lager beer. And between them, they are holding a box, and the box says ballots. And so the accusation that's being made by this cartoon is that immigrants, with their old world drinking practices, are undermining American democracy. They are stealing American democracy for their own interests and purposes. There's also an element of, and this was particularly true at this moment in the 1880s and 1890s, as the saloon industry really is beginning to proliferate, especially in immigrant neighborhoods where saloons are really common. And for immigrants, they're often a really important space for gathering with one's community, maybe speaking your native language, maybe getting news from home or even mail or job opportunities. But for anti-alcohol advocates, these saloons were really just a den of vice, which they sometimes also were. To be quite honest, they were often sites of prostitution as well. So we need to keep in mind that these are complicated arguments. Another argument that was made by anti-alcohol advocates was that alcohol was unchristian, and that the true nature of American society and politics should be Christian at their core. And so the effort to ban alcohol was part of a larger effort to reform American politics according to Protestant, specifically Protestant, theology and morality. And third, and I don't have an image to go with it here, but I think it's really important, is race. That over the course of the late 19th and especially into the early 20th century, as Jim Crow, especially in the South, becomes sort of a hard and fast legal system that really defines every aspect of Southern life, over these years, an increasing accusation against Black men that when they had access to alcohol and they drank it, they would always seek a white woman to assault. So these are these accusations that there's been a lot of research into these accusations. They are by and large unfounded and really based on a hysteria that was present about Black men at the time, and especially and really about the looming prospect of Black men gaining political power. But this is an important part of, especially in the South, the anti-alcohol movement. So especially considering, though, these two elements, it's really no surprise that Jews were, as they say, wet as opposed to dry. They were opposed to any kind of prohibition legislation, and they were hostile to the temperance movement, in some part because it was in, as we've seen, it was in their economic interest to be opposed to prohibition. They saw it as a direct threat to their communal economies. But also, they saw temperance and prohibition as an imposition of religion on civic life. And they spoke out against prohibition legislation as, at its core, unconstitutional, in direct as being in direct contradiction with the First Amendment that guarantees freedom of religion. And so they pushed back against it from political position as well. And at the same time, they often utilized an idea about Jewish alcohol consumption in particular, which is that Jews were not known for heavy drinking, that they were known for drinking in moderation, or if they drank at all. This is a claim that I hear a lot currently too. I'm not quite sure. I don't want to underplay the role that alcohol, the deleterious role that alcohol has played in the lives of some Jews. But this was an idea about Jewish alcohol consumption in moderation that had real power. There was one rabbi who was known as Alphabet Brown because his name was like, I think, four. It was like an acronym of four letters, which I forget currently. But Alphabet Brown was a rabbi who went around the United States giving speeches about prohibition. And the line that he would often give is, "The Jew drinks, but he knows when to stop." Again, I am not making any claims about the truth of that argument. I'm just saying that, discursively, this argument was put to use by American Jews at this time for both political purposes, and also, in terms of their own interests. Again, we can see here the universal and the particular at work, right? That these are Jews who are saying we are part of a larger civic American life, and we recognize the Constitution and what it promises to the American people, and prohibition will undermine that. And so we're arguing for the Constitution, but we're doing so also as Jews. So again, we can see this is a moment where there's not a lot of tension between the two. It's actually quite a comfortable space, and we will see that changes. Because during the progressive era, so we were talking about like the late 19th century into the early 20th century, the American press began to turn its attention to the alcohol business in particular. They sort of muckraking journalists began to investigate alcohol production as a problem in American life. And some of them turned to Jews who produced alcohol as a problem in particular. And so these ideas nationally bolstered anti-Semitic theories about Jews and money and power. This idea that here we see sort of like an economic anti-Semitism and prohibitionism that intertwine accusations against the alcohol industry generally with ideas about Jews specifically as unscrupulous, as economically parasitic, as willing to undermine social order for their own economic gain. And these accusations had followed Jews for many really centuries, and here they come to the United States. And of course, these accusations had predated the Prohibition movement, but the Prohibition movement really wove them together in a way that many American Jews found quite frightening. And they found it especially frightening as the Prohibition movement gained not only power, but eventually success. So by the time we get to 1918 or so, when the United States, very briefly, in the Great War, the war to end all wars, about half of American states had already declared themselves dry. The federal government has already created a Wartime Prohibition Act. And then in 1919, the 18th Amendment, which took all the constitutional amendments always take a long time to gain state ratification, and it had taken several, I think, a year or so. But by the time we get to 1919, 30 more than the requisite number, eventually 36 states had ratified the amendment, and it was voted at that point. The amendment was passed, and then in 1920. That is the beginning of the Prohibition era, because it's the time when the Volstead Act, which is the sort of the legal structure of what Prohibition was going to look like, was passed. And so on January 1st, 2020, starting on January 1st, 1920, there is this new enforcement structure that prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors for beverage purposes. I'm not arguing here that anti-Semitism was the main cause of the eventual passage of the 18th Amendment. It wasn't the main cause of Prohibition's eventual success. It is worth arguing that that main cause was anti-German sentiment in the years leading up to and then during what we call the First World War, when the majority of American brewers were either German immigrants or the descendants of German immigrants, and not Jewish German immigrants, but mostly Lutherans. And they were regarded increasingly as agents of the Kaiser, kind of as a fifth column who sought to utilize precious American resources like wheat to make beer that was going to undermine the health and well-being of American soldiers. And this anti-German hysteria during the war had led to actually the lynching of a German immigrant, I think in St. Louis, and the passage of laws in several states that it was illegal to speak the German language, and so on. So this, this anti-German hysteria and the anti-Semitism that had become part of the Prohibition movement definitely followed American Jews into the Prohibition era. And one of the main agents of that was Henry Ford. And most people know of Henry Ford as a car manufacturer. Those of us who study American history, American Jewish history, also know him as probably the most I guess you would say successful anti-Semite of the early 20th century. He was a popularizer of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a forgery that had been created in Europe to make accusations against Jews and claim that Jewish power was undermining the people and that Jews sought to basically run the world for their own gain. He has them translated into English and publishes them in his own newspaper um, in a sort of a sub-series that's known as The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. And so over the course of half a decade, he wrote about Jews in a way that was, for American Jews, quite frightening. And he often wrote about Jewish involvement in the alcohol industry. We need to keep in mind that Ford was a teetotaler and a prohibitionist. And yet he seemed to keep coming back to the ways that he believed that Jews had ruined the American alcohol trade. He said that the Jew is on the side of liquor and always has been. He said that distilling is one of the long line of businesses that has been ruined by Jewish monopoly. So noticing that Jews were very much involved in the distilling industry, particularly of whiskey and rye. Jews were, it certainly was not a Jewish monopoly, and Jews weren't even in the majority. But the presence of Jews were amplified in his mind by his hostility to Jews. And he also said the bulk of organized bootlegging is in the hands of Jews. And I'll add another here from a Ku Klux Klan newspaper in Dallas, Texas, where he says that my fight right now is against the homebrew and the Hebrew. The rhyme does some work for him. But by homebrew, he means, and this is 1925, so it's in the middle of Prohibition. And so he's referring to the capacity to make beer or distilled liquors or even wine, but this is really referring to both beer and liquor, to be able to make it at home, kind of in private, and then sell it for consumption, which was illegal. Both of those things were illegal. Now, it must be said, it's important to keep in mind that, in fact, of the bootleggers that are so famous from their activities in the Prohibition era, Jews were a part of it. But I have here Arnold Rothstein, Meyer Lansky, Longy Zwillman, and Detroit's Purple Gang. And these are kind of just some of the most well-known. It seemed as if, in my research, every city any city where there was a significant Jewish population usually had like maybe one Jewish bootlegger, or sometimes it was a more significant number. But in places like New York, Chicago, Detroit, where immigrant populations were really robust, it wasn't only Jews. It was also often Italian and Irish immigrants. But these were young men of immigrant background, often came from working class backgrounds, who had been involved in probably some gang and criminal activity back before Prohibition. And it seemed that when Prohibition began, the criminal enterprises from before Prohibition just didn't recognize how much money they could make by selling illegal alcohol. So these young men, Lansky and Zwillman, and along with Italians like Al Capone and Irish immigrants too, sort of stepped into the breach and became very famous for selling alcohol illegally. I think it's fair to say that these are the most famous of the Prohibition era lawbreakers, but they're also the least typical of those lawbreakers because they were doing it at scale in huge quantities, whereas most people who bootlegged alcohol did it in much smaller quantities, maybe even just for their own personal consumption. And I'm often asked, and this actually I think happened last night, I was asked, like, well, what about the bootleggers? And so of course, here are the bootleggers. And I understand why they are of interest. They're kind of glamorous. They have a reputation for being kind of tough Jews during an era when Jews were often regarded as like less sort of masculine, I guess you could say, than other kinds of immigrants. And so they really kind of took on this like masculinity and ran with it. And often in collaboration with Irish and Italian immigrants. So these were, very interethnic criminal enterprises. But I also want to point out, though, that these men were murderers and extortionists, and their victims were also often Jews. So I am really resistant to I'm hesitant to give them the kind of glamorization that they so often get in American culture because I find them morally suspect. But I think it's important, and here's a much less well-known source of bootlegged alcohol in the United States. This guy always gets a laugh. I mean, I understand why he's got the cigarette hanging out of his mouth. It's just kind of an amazing picture, and I'm delighted to have found it. So here's the thing about the Volstead Act. Though it barred alcohol, its manufacture, its sale, its transportation, for beverage purposes, it did have a couple of special dispensations. One of them was for medicinal purposes, and that's a whole nother story about like a gaping hole that was left in the Volstead Act. But the other important one, and the one that's I think interesting for our purposes, is Section 6 of the Volstead Act, which created a sort of an industry. Special dispensation for sacramental wine for religious ritual purposes. And so, I mean, it wasn't only Jews who would like to access alcohol for religious ritual, it was also Catholics and Episcopalians. But in order for the 18th Amendment to not conflict with the First Amendment, this loophole needed to be created, this dispensation needed to be created. And so what would happen is that if a Jew, a member of a congregation, and you had to be a member of a congregation, that's important here, if a member of a congregation wanted to access alcohol for Shabbat or Passover purposes, they would have to apply to the rabbi. And the rabbi basically becomes the entrepreneur here, and he has to fill out like forms in triplicate, which is a whole nother problem. And then the rabbi would go to specially sanctioned sacramental wine stores, like the one we see behind us here, or behind me here. And the rabbi would then be responsible for distributing the wine to the Jews who had accessed it, who had asked for its access. So there are two problems here. And Section 6 was written in collaboration with a Jewish senator and the leaders of the American Reform Jewish movement. So this was written with Jewish input. But there are two problems here. One is that sacramental wine in Jewish ritual is consumed at home. And that's really different than in Christian and Catholic churches who use sacramental wine, where it's consumed in the church. So the clergyman would apply for wine. It would come to him. He would dispense it sort of by the sipful or maybe the cupful in the church, and that's the end of that. But in Jewish ritual, because it happens at home around the dinner table, once the rabbi gave it to the family who had asked for it, there's no oversight about what would happen to it after that. And through this Section 6, every Jewish family could apply for 10 gallons of wine per year. The second problem is that as opposed to churches, Christian, Catholic, religious denominations, and as opposed really to the ordination of rabbis today, back then there was no ecclesiastical hierarchy that ordained rabbis. There were some rabbinical schools, but you have to remember that this is an era where there are thousands of Eastern European Jews who are themselves immigrants to the United States, who were sort of granted the title of rabbi in Eastern Europe, but without any sort of institutional imprimatur. And there was no way to prove who was really a rabbi and who wasn't. Right, so you can kind of see where this is going. Almost immediately, the distribution of sacramental wine, particularly from Jewish sources, totally exploded. And we can see here, even as early as, by the end of 1920, we have a temple, a Reform temple in Chico, California, that has decided that they are just not going to do wine at all because it's too much of an issue. And I'll talk a little bit more about that presently. This idea of pseudo rabbis getting liquor, and that San Francisco congregations are up in arms about the mess that's been created. Um, you know, Jewish leaders were mortified and horrified by the scandal that had been created by what was known as the rabbi wine scandal that had been created starting in 1920 and really lasted until the middle of the decade, because there was no oversight of consumption and no oversight of distribution and no oversight of who could be a rabbi. And so this is, I mean, the Yiddish term for it is a shanda, for those who know Yiddish, which means like a shame. And that for Jews who were paying attention to this, this was regarded as a deep shame that was sort of printed on American Jews writ large, because there are growing accusations that, or fears that Jews would be scapegoated for what seems to be Prohibition's growing failure, and that Jews would be accused of exploiting the Constitution, exploiting this loophole in the Volstead Act for their own gain, even though the loophole had been written in a way that had been hoped to align Jewish practice with American law. So, how to respond? Much disagreement in how to respond. So some Reform Jews, as you can see here, moved to ban wine altogether and say, you know what, we don't need wine, we can just use grape juice instead, and we can use that in our Shabbos services, we can use this at Passover. I don't know what they would do for Purim, because you're really supposed to drink quite a lot for Purim, but that was besides the point. So Reform rabbis went to Orthodox rabbinic organizations and said, well, let's convene on this and get rid of the wine so that we can be aligned with the law. The saying, in this comes from Talmud, in Hebrew, is dina demahuta dina, which means the law of the land is the law. And so it's a guiding principle for Jews in diaspora living amongst non-Jews. What do you do when Jewish law conflicts with the law of the people amongst whom you live? The law of the land is the law. Prohibition is the law of the land. We should comply. And the Orthodox rabbis said, yeah, the law of the land gives us access to 10 gallons of wine per year per family. We're following the law. And so, like, give us a break. We are in alignment with American law in a way that you are just trying to be more assimilated. And that's, we're not going to participate in that. In addition, in excuse me, in around 1926, there was someone who I haven't really been able to find out much about, a man named Fred Goldberg, who had traveled to the Palestinian Jewish settlement that was part of the growing Zionist movement. And he had an idea that though the wine laws, the rabbinic wine laws or the sacramental wine laws had been, the access had been diminished, that maybe one way to solve a problem here is to make a new rule that only wine produced by wineries in Palestine would be considered sufficiently kosher to apply to Section 6. So for him, this is kind of, solving two problems. It's supporting the Yishuv, the growing Zionist movement and settlement, and also would solve this problem of potentially solve the problem of Jewish alcohol production in the United States. And once the leaders of the American Reform Jewish movement find out about this, they are enraged, because for them, this is precisely the kind of move that they thought would incur even more anti-Semitism. The idea that Jews will be able to flout the Constitution and in the process support what is considered the Jewish national home on the Mediterranean Sea. And at the time, the Reform Judaism, or as a movement, was still very much anti-Zionist. They were really opposed to the Zionist movement. That would change over time, but for them, they just wanted to put the kibosh on that whole thing. And they were, as far as I could tell, they were able to, but I haven't really been able to follow Fred Goldberg very far into the historical record. And then there were some Jews who joined the movement to repeal the 18th Amendment. And some of them were actually within the leadership of the Reform Jewish movement. But they were scolded by their bosses, who were afraid that Jewish involvement in these anti-prohibition politics would be seen as Jewish self-interest. And one of them said very explicitly, this should be an argument among Christians, and Jews should stay out of it. Eventually, the Prohibition movement, though succeeded, it was really only 13 years. I'm sorry. Oh no, what just happened? Uh-oh. Can you get me back to, okay, thank you. Yeah, let's just go there. Thank you. So eventually I had another slide of the repeal movement. I don't know where it went, but in 1933, eventually, Prohibition, after years of argument over whether this movement was a success or the law had been a total failure. In 1933, of course, it is the depths of the national prohibition, of the Great Depression. Roosevelt has campaigned on the promise that he will repeal prohibition. He's elected in 32, inaugurated in 33, and one of the first things that he does is push the 21st Amendment, which is the only amendment ever in a part of American constitutional history that repeals a previous amendment. So the 21st Amendment is passed in 1933, and Prohibition comes to a close. And indeed, some of the bootleggers, both Jewish and otherwise, but some bootleggers then ended up transitioning to the legal alcohol business. People like Sam Bronfman, who was a Canadian Jewish family that had been a really important source of American bootlegged alcohol, especially across the Detroit River, but all over the United States, gets involved in the legal industry. Louis Rosenstiel, who's a name that is less known, but he had purchased, over the course of the end of the Prohibition era, had purchased warehouses of alcohol, particularly of whiskey and other distilled liquors, so when Prohibition is repealed, for most alcohol producers, it's like, okay, now we got to start from scratch. And it takes anyone who is a fan of distilled liquors, of like whiskey and rye, know that it's supposed to be aged. So they're getting back into the business, but it's going to take them a little while to actually have a product that they can sell. But Rosenstiel can hit the ground running because he's got warehouses filled with mostly alcohol that had been categorized as for medicinal purposes. But he just is able to bring it to market as legal alcohol. And this also paves the way, while we're talking about kosher wine, paves the way for the development of a kosher wine industry. There were some very small kosher vintners before the Prohibition era and during Prohibition too, but they were really local, always very local. In 1940 or so, Monarch Wine, which is one of those companies that had mostly been importing wine from Palestine, goes to the Manischewitz family, who had been already at this point well known for mass-producing matzah, and he makes an agreement to license their name. And so the Manischewitz, we think of Manischewitz as, of course, that's the kosher wine, but that really is a product of the repeal of Prohibition, the fact that we think of Manischewitz as sort of like the drink, the sort of sacramental wine that is most well known. And today, Jews have certainly become part of the modern alcohol industry. And I have these are two advertisements for a whiskey. It's called Whiskey Jubilee, spelled J-E-W, and Funky Jubilation, spelled J-E-W, for a beer. The company is known as He Brew. So we could see here kind of like self-consciously kitschy, cheeky, alcohol, small batch craft production that utilizes Jewish identity in the 21st century. And that's, I mean, I think this is a really interesting phenomenon. And I think that context matters here powerfully, that they are able to utilize Jewish identity as part of their, of not just making the alcohol, but marketing it, really speaks to how different alcohol has become in American sort of civic life, that it was in the past regarded as like, they would call it demon rum. It was the mother of all iniquities and the most dangerous product available on the American marketplace, which to us, I think, seems really quaint, considering, you know, we're several decades into a war on drugs. So this really speaks to how much American ideas about alcohol has changed. And how not just the meaning of alcohol, but the meaning of Jewishness, when intertwined with one another, how that has changed and transformed over the course of the 20th into the 21st century. But what has remained constant is American Jews' negotiation between maintaining an idea of difference and separateness and an idea of merging into the American civic mainstream, to the constant struggle and desire and debate over what it means to simultaneously be both a part of the people and a people apart. Thank you. Okay. Good, great.
So we have plenty of time for questions and discussions. There are mics up here, but we can make mics to you.
Yeah, why don't we bring mics to folks who yes. I mean, it's you could definitely buy it on Amazon. I hate to do that, but I wish I could say your local bookstore, but it probably not. Yeah, but they will order it. Yes, yes. Alas.
If I remember correctly, one of the prominent Jewish bootleggers was Joseph Kennedy.
He wasn't Jewish. He was Irish.
I'm sorry, Irish.
Yes. An important distinction.
I'm wondering if he had any connections with any of the Jewish bootleggers.
I think that there was a lot of, I mean, one of the problems with doing research into illegal activity is that people don't really leave records in a way that, like, as an archival historian, I need. But I definitely did see record of Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants, and Eastern European, particularly Jewish immigrants, working together. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if someone like Kennedy was, engaged with, for instance, the Bronfmans. But I don't know I don't have any record of the specific details of that. Wait. Yeah. Coming at you both sides.
Now I feel embarrassed.
Oh, don't be. Yes, ma'am.
The Rothschild connection of the Rothschild with the wine industry in Israel.
Absolutely.
And was your research and Jews and booze only in America?
I was focused on the United States, but I don't think that you can really think about the development of the yeshuv, which is the Hebrew word for the settlements, the Jewish settlements that were emerging in the early Zionist movement, starting in the 1890s or so, when European Jews began traveling to to Palestine to try and settle there. They had hoped to do so as agricultural workers, but these are, they're socialist intellectuals and they don't have any experience with farming, and so they fail miserably for at least a decade, if not two. But they are able to get in contact with, I believe it's Jacob Rothschild, who has recently purchased the Lafitte winery in France, sort of the most like of the highest prestige winery in France, and they convince him to contribute to and he wasn't a Zionist either. He was really an anti-Zionist, but he was convinced to support them by sending to Palestine some grapevine shoots and one of his experts to teach some of the new settlers how to grow grapes for wine and then how to produce wine. And that really became such an important economic resource for this early movement that then intersects with American life in the ways that I've described before. So though I don't go in depth into that story, he's in there, and that part of the development of of Zionism, I think, is really crucial.
He's done more than just wine. He had an agricultural school. He employed people that taught the people how to
Right.
settle. He bought the land for those.
Right.
And one of the problems is Yishuv is settlement, but now it's very different.
Okay.
The meaning of the word settlers and Yishuv.
Well, okay. Okay.
The word settlement's a
That-
controversial word today.
Start getting into.
You get
I
a very,
mean,
very controversial issue today.
they settled. Let's say that.
A question about liquor and hard spirits versus wine.
Yes.
Why did I guess the Jewish producers do so well in spirits and alcohol and not in the wine industry, other than specialized like Manischewitz and so forth?
Why?
Why did they?
Because I mean, I think it's really because the American wine industry, really after the Second World War, the American wine industry was a trickle compared to beer and distilled liquors. Just Americans didn't really drink wine to the degree that they do now, that we do now. It was, I mean, the idea that, of course, you drink wine with dinner and it's a lovely evening and you go to a restaurant. This is a really a modern consumer idea that back in the 19th century was only present in the lives of the elite. And so for Americans, it was beer.
What happened to all those Jewish businesses that didn't become bootleggers? Were a lot of them thrown out of business?
They had to change their businesses. I mean, so I found a wide range. I found some Jewish saloon keepers who just they would often sell all of their alcohol, kind of like fire sale discount, and bought a stock of shoes and became a shoe store. I found a couple of those in Atlanta. I found one distiller that shifted their production to flavorings, which required the same kind of distilling technology, and also had some alcohol content to it too, but wasn't sold for alcohol as beverage consumption, and perhaps. But so yeah, a lot of them. Some of them just went into a different line of business. Some of them repurposed the work that they did already. And the following generation, I mean, this is sort of like a generational moment and this is important too, that as Prohibition is coming to an end is kind of at the exact same time as a new generation of native-born American Jews are more likely to go into professions and to be educated towards the law or medicine or the professoriate, rather than towards entrepreneurship. And so the number of Jews who might have, and I think this is probably certainly true for other ethnic groups too, that the number that might have gone into the alcohol business before Prohibition, that number would just have been much less afterwards, or much fewer afterwards, because they were seeking other ways of both acculturating and making a living for themselves and their families and their communities.
So I have two personal questions.
Uh-oh.
But before I start with that, since you just mentioned the shoe store, my father used to always come home with things that I would ask him where he got them from, and he would always say the shoe store. And so it makes me wonder, I mean, no matter what
is
it
it
was.
like the shoe
Yeah,
store?
and so I wonder,
Yeah.
was the shoe store just a front for other black market products?
So I'll tell you a personal story too. So I wrote this book about Jews and booze, and then after, I think that my mom did this on purpose because she didn't want me to write about it. After the book is like already in galleys, she tells me that her father, my grandfather, who was a pharmacist, made bathtub gin and sold it out of the pharmacy. So I wouldn't be a bit surprised if some of these businesses, these shoe stores, were like, yeah, you could buy shoes, but in the back, we got the juice for you too. Yeah.
But those weren't my questions. So
Okay.
one question relates to my personal experience growing up in an American Reform Jewish home in the second half of the 20th century. And then one that relates to your experience. But the first one is, you mentioned that wine wasn't really the favored beverage. And so, but we all know about Manischewitz and, I wonder were we sort of content to, even though it's not really a beloved flavor or taste, were we sort of just content to settle for Manischewitz as the primary sacramental wine that we would always turn to for all of our holidays and Shabbat services because wine was never preferred?
Do you want to ask the second question and I'll go back to the first one?
Sure. Okay, I'm being bold, so you don't have to answer the second one.
Okay.
But so I wasn't here when you were introduced, so you might have already spoken about this. But since you have selected this topic for so much study, I am wondering about what your relationship to alcohol was. But
You are the first person to ask me that question in 10 years.
And if it has changed as you have dug into this research.
Great. Okay. All right. So, first question first. The kosher wine industry was itself really limited up until, I would say, probably the 1980s. And this is, especially domestic wine producers at that time are beginning to think about Jews and Jews who keep kosher as a possible market. Before that, I mean, again, like domestic wine production was still pretty limited. And so for kosher production specifically, like if you are an observant Jew, you really need to make sure that the wine is produced for kosher purposes. And then there's an even more like limited parameters for kosher LePesach, for Passover. And so, I mean, I think that part of it is marketing, that the Manischewitz company, the Monarch company, and others like Shapiro Kosher Wine, who for some reason their motto was wine so thick you can cut it with a knife. And I don't know why that's good, but that's how they advertised themselves. I think that they had just really cornered the market on what it meant to drink kosher wine. And the fact that, it's mass produced, in ways that are widely available in stores that sell kosher products. So it's marketing, it's like distribution, and rather than like Jews are just willing to settle for it, like I have very fond memories of Manischewitz, even though like that first sip is really kind of horrifying. But you get to the bottom of the first cup of Passover, and it starts to be pretty good. And so I think that that's been part of the experience, and it's only recently that people have realized that they have other options, and that the technologies of kosher wine production have become more widely available, and that kosher wine is actually quite good now. What's available is good. The second question, I've never been a huge drinker. I'm a lightweight. And which I think a lot of Jews would say that they are. And I don't know if I actually did participate when I was a graduate student. There was a study done by Emory's School of Public Health, trying to figure out if there was some kind of genetic component in Eastern European Jews and Chinese people that made them more likely to, it was like an allergy to alcohol, or they got drunk more quickly. And so they, they took a vial of my blood to test it. And I don't know what happened to that vial, but I asked them as they're taking my blood, I'm like, do you guys think about like the social components here at all? Like how Jews are raised with alcohol? Like the fact that like since I was a baby, my family didn't celebrate Sabbath every week, but certainly Passover. I always, like, since I was a child, I had access to wine on, those special occasions. And some Jews have said that that is a reason why, that it was never forbidden. It was always part of like a family experience, that's been one of the reason for, generally speaking, Jewish religious or alcohol moderation. And the person taking my blood was just like, I don't know what you're talking about. And that was the end of that. But I think, like a lot of people, my desire to drink alcohol was kind of crushed by the pandemic. And so most of the beer I drink now is non-alcoholic. Just because, mostly for calories purposes. But that's, I guess, the answer to your question. My relationship to alcohol was not changed by my book, but it was maybe changed by the fact that I'm getting older. There you go. Is that okay? Okay.
Yes.
Howard, how many buildings in Brandeis were built by bootleggers?
That's a good question. I mean, I couldn't give you, I don't know why you're asking him. I'm standing right here. I know, but still, I wrote the book. I couldn't give you an exact number, but there's no question that both Rosenstiel and Bronfman were huge contributors, not only to Brandeis, but to federations all over the country, and to Israel as well. So, I mean, that's another thing that's worth keeping in mind, is that these industrialists, these liquor industrialists, after repeal, became sort of leaders, communal leaders, through their success, making and selling alcohol at huge scale. And so that, I mean, maybe that's another part of the story of why Jewish alcohol production has sort of taken a back seat in American Jewish life in terms of like anxieties, is because that philanthropy has been really crucial to 20th century Jewish history.
Was there a temperance movement in the Jewish community, like the Salvation Army or whatever?
So in the mid to so in the 1870s, 1880s, this is an era when Christian women, American women, are becoming much more engaged in politics. They don't have the vote yet, but they. It's one of the reasons that they become really the leaders. The Women's Christian Temperance Union becomes such a leader in anti-alcohol movements. And for Jewish women, this posed both an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity being for Jewish women who wanted to be engaged in politics, especially German Jewish women who wanted to be engaged in American politics like that, anti-alcohol was an opportunity. But Jewish men were really opposed to that form of activism. And also, organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union weren't just anti-alcohol, they were also like deeply involved in proselytizing. And so these were really kind of unfriendly. They weren't unfriendly to Jewish women, but it was clear that they also were very intent on Jewish conversion to Christianity. And so I found a couple of pieces of evidence of Jewish women speaking out against alcohol, but it is crushed by Jewish men.
Can you realistically, or just simply as a custom, and how it was used in the synagogue, if it was?
Sure, it's not really used in the synagogue. This is around the table at home. And it depends on the event. If we're talking about Sabbath, that it is a part of the ritual to bring in the Sabbath with a Kaddish, a kiddush for that includes wine, like a blessing to wine, and everyone participates in the drinking of the wine, and then it becomes part of the dinner beverage. And then on Passover, which happens, in the spring of every year, the ritual includes, according to the Haggadah, which is the book that sort of tells the story of the Exodus and gives the order of the ceremony that everyone engages in both before and after the meal itself. That ceremony includes 4 glasses of wine. Right. But my experience has always been that 4 glasses of wine is really meant to be kind of like a quarter of a glass of wine, and you empty it. But that for some, you're obligated to fill the glass. So you can imagine it can be a pretty exciting event. Yeah. But so those are 2 of the sort of the ritual moments. But every week there is, for an observant Jew, wine is served to the family at home every week for Sabbath on Friday night. Okay. Yes.
It's hot. So one advantage of getting older is you start to put the puzzle pieces of your younger life together. And I had a grandfather who had a saloon in Nyack, New York.
Uh-huh.
He went bankrupt 8 times, but he survived.
Mhm.
But when I was growing up at the table, we often had a guest named Stella Frankfurter, and she was on the board for Rosensteel.
Huh.
And I'd ask my parents, I guess, why was she on the board? Well, it was obvious.
There's that
Because
connection.
of Felix.
Right.
So they protected themselves.
Okay. I'm sorry, and you also had a question, didn't you? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Everything I've read about, well, most everything I've read about Prohibition includes the remark, more people drank during Prohibition than before. Is that really factual?
Again, it's really hard to know because, if people are drinking on the sly and illegally, we don't have records, and we don't have records of alcohol that's produced. All we might have is records of alcohol that has been sort of taken by the police, for instance. But for every gallon of whiskey taken by the police, it's possible that another 1 or 2 actually made it to a consumer. What is likely is that in places, so this would probably be more answered on a local level, in places where people were for Prohibition, where they had sort of fought for Prohibition politically, and were happy with the passage of the 18th Amendment, drinking went down. And in places where that wasn't true, alcohol was more widely available. And it is possible. I do think it's possible that the sort of the excitement and frisson of going against the law is for some people was really quite enticing about engaging in alcohol consumption during Prohibition. And I'll say one other thing here about speakeasies. And this isn't just a Jewish story, this is an American story. That previous to Prohibition, saloons was the main place where public drinking happened. And these saloons, with the exception of prostitutes, these were all male environments. Women were not welcome in these spaces. Speakeasies became more heterosocial environments. They were spaces where women were welcome to come drink. They often had tables. Saloons were basically you belly up to the bar, and there's no place to sit. But speakeasies often had tables, and they were more comfortable spaces for women to actually be. And so I would say it's possible that women who would never have been to a public drinking environment before Prohibition would have frequented them for fun during Prohibition, and that really shaped women's drinking practices thereafter. That's my suspicion. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the great questions.
We have a little memento. We framed your flyer so that you can take it home and enjoy it, perhaps. Yes. And before I left, I want to thank our founding sponsors, Sam Tenenbaum and Bruce Rogo as well, who have made our talks possible. Our next talk will be somewhere late August. It'll be on memory and the Holocaust with Professor Agnes Mueller from the University of South Carolina. It should be very good. And so thank you again. It's wonderful to have you with us. And thank all of you for coming. And we have some refreshments out there. I hope you'll come with cookies and coffee. No, we weren't up to that yet. But there's a lot of places you can go if this started out. So thanks all of you.